Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to watch my presentation. My name is Liesl Francisco, and I'm a senior English literature major at Concordia. I'll also graduate with a communications minor and professional writing certificate. Um, and so just a little bit about the context of this project. This is my senior thesis. And so I've been working on this for the past semester, and we were actually allowed to either rework a previous paper that we had done or start completely fresh. So I decided to do a paper that I had completed my sophomore year in my American literature class. And I decided to rework that and kind of add another text in that I had read this fall. And so just kind of mashing those ideas together and creating something new. So it's been really fun so far. And yeah, I hope you enjoy. So the title of my project is called The Destruction of Transgressing Women in Literature Over Time. And in this project, I examine three texts. So The Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett, A Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams, and Carrie by Stephen King. So there's kind of two parts to my thesis. So there's the foundational idea, first of all, that these three texts that I just named exemplify the archetype of the transgressing woman. And so based on what happens in the plot of those three books, it becomes evident that the transgressing woman, her rejection of social norms brings about her destruction. So that's kind of the foundational idea that I've laid out. And then the little more argumentative part of my thesis is that even though she is ultimately destroyed like the other transgressing woman characters, Carrie White acts as destroyer as well. So the two transgressing women characters in The Maltese Falcon and A Streetcar Named Desire essentially disappear from their stories at the end. And Carrie kind of creates this legacy that lasts, even though she is destroyed ultimately as well. There's still a legacy that goes on. So first off, I wanted to start with some definitions because not everybody is around these kind of terms every day. So the femme fatale is kind of your typical female villain. She's cunning, she's beautiful, manipulative. A lot of times she's the antagonist in her story, and it's a very old archetype. I mean, you can think back to Greek myths where there's a femme fatale, like Medusa, for instance, or Circe, I think would be another one. And so then there's also the transgressing woman archetype, and that's actually a broader category. The femme fatale is actually a subcategory within the transgressing woman. So the transgressing woman basically violates societal boundaries, and that's what leads to her ruin. So moving on to the characters. As I kind of mentioned already, Carrie White is the protagonist in Carrie, aptly named. And then there's also Bridget O'Shaughnessy and Blanche Dubois. So Bridget is a classic femme fatale. She's the antagonist in The Maltese Falcon, which was written in 1930. And it's a noir fiction book. So femme fatales are pretty common in noir or detective fiction. And so she, throughout her story, feigns innocence and seduces the male protagonist, who is the detective, Sam Spade. And she basically hires him as a detective, but she gives him this fake story and this fake name. And so he's following the leads that she's given him, but she's really just trying to throw him off the scent of her trail because she's the criminal. And then, so Blanche is the protagonist in A Streetcar Named Desire, which is a play written in 1947. And in the play, she goes to stay with her sister Stella and her brother-in-law Stanley. And so those are the Kowalskis. And as she stays with the Kowalskis, she also feigns innocence, which is interesting. She's also a little bit manipulative, like Bridget, and exhibits tendencies that are morally independent from societal values. So she's not a femme fatale, really. I would call her a transgressing woman. But yeah, and then there's Carrie White. She's an adolescent. So whereas the other two are adult women, Carrie is a little bit different simply because of age. She's oppressed by her mother's religious practices and ostracized by her peers because of her unique religious household. And she eventually uses her telekinetic powers to destroy her town. She kind of just snaps from that, just being made fun of by her peers, being oppressed by her mother, causes her to snap and cause chaos. So here's Bridget O'Shaughnessy in the 1941 film. And there's kind of 3 dimensions which I've measured these characters in, just to kind of get a better idea of who's really a femme fatale and who's a transgressing woman, and not specifically a femme fatale, and where are the differences and what might this mean? So the classic femme fatale is economically, morally, and sexually independent, and that's what Bridget is. She pays Sam Spade $200 in the 20s and 30s, or 20s or 30s, for his detective work, which would probably be about like $2,000 to $3,000 now. And so the fact that she just paid him for his detective work just to throw him off the scent of her trail definitely displays economic independence. So then she's morally independent. She is in search of this object called the Maltese Falcon, and it's worth like $200,000 in the 20s or 30s. So can imagine how much it would, with inflation, we can kind of compare that to a lot of money today. And so she's in search of that, and like will do anything to get it. She is the reason for some of the deaths in the book. And she doesn't really care. So definitely morally independent from societal norms. And then she's sexually independent as she seduces Sam Spade to distract him from his goals. And then we have Blanche Dubois. As I said, I just call her a transgressing woman, not specifically a femme fatale. And she is economically dependent, I've determined, since she goes to stay with her sister for an unspecified amount of time. She kind of mooches off of them as she's there. And eventually Stanley, to get her to leave, buys her a bus ticket. And then morally, she's independent, and I've determined that by her drinking habits. She actually, the first scene shows her talking to her sister Stella, and she says, "Open your pretty mouth and talk while I look around for some liquor. I know you must have some liquor on the place." So, I mean, that's kind of strange. She starts rummaging through cabinets and just like going through their house for liquor. So if I was a guest, I don't think I would do that. And so, yeah, that shows her moral independence. She doesn't really care what people think. She just wants a drink. And then she is sexually independent as she has a reputation with the Flamingo Hotel, which is seen as a dishonorable establishment. She denies outwardly any association with the flamingo when Stanley confronts her and asks her about it, but the stage directions show that she closes her eyes as if faint when Stanley turns away, suggesting that she's hiding her connection with the establishment. So, and she also kisses a young boy in almost a predatory scene. So this young boy stops by the house. I think he's picking up donations for the newspaper or something like that. And she kisses him. The narrator says he looks uncomfortable. And she essentially like sends him away saying, I have to be good now and keep my hands off of children. So it was a very uncomfortable scene for the reader or the viewer, and definitely shows that she has sexual ideologies or acts in sexual ways that are not seen as acceptable in society. So then there's Carrie White. These are two great pictures throughout the 1976 film that there's probably not a whole lot of time that passes between them. So as you can tell, something really big happens. And as I said, Carrie White starts out, she's probably about 16, so she's economically dependent. She is a high school living in her mother's household, so she doesn't have a whole lot of options there. Morally, she's independent. Her mother tries to make her submit to her own religious ideology, but can't force Carrie's mind. You can't force someone to believe something or just to think something. So, for example, Carrie's mother says, "Bow your head, let's us pray." Mama brought her hand down on the back of Carrie's neck, and behind it was all the heavy muscle developed by 11 years of slinging heavy laundry bags and trucking piles of wet sheets. Carrie's eye-bulging face jerked forward, and her forehead smacked the altar. So in this scene, Carrie's mother physically forces her to bow her head, but she can't force Carrie to think anything. And then sexually, she develops more sexual independence as time goes on. She goes to prom with Tommy, her high school crush, despite her mother Margaret's protests. Margaret didn't even want her going to a dance, let alone a dance with a boy. And Carrie actually sews her own dress and wears it to prom, and it's pretty revealing, as the book describes. So the reader can really tell Carrie is looking for more sexual freedom and independence. And so the most important point that I want to make is that Carrie, the book, is different than The Maltese Falcon and A Streetcar Named Desire. And Carrie White, as a transgressing woman, is different than both Bridget and Blanche. So Carrie actually goes down in history in the end of her novel, but Bridget and Blanche essentially disappear from their narratives. Bridget is caught by the police by the end, and Blanche is sent to a mental institution. So they both are destroyed, and there's not really any lasting legacy, whereas Carrie, although her own mother ends up killing her, she kills her mother as well. But so Carrie is ultimately destroyed, but before she's destroyed, she destroys the whole town. So she acts as destroyer, but she also leaves behind this legacy, which is apparent through Stephen King has peppered like pop culture and scientific journal articles throughout Carrie's narrative, which are, fictional in our sense, but like in the world of Carrie, they are true and they're from the future. So it's kind of showing, like, one of the characters in Carrie wrote a book about the climactic moment of Carrie's life, I guess I should say. And like, there's also scientific journal articles about Carrie's telekinetic abilities. And it really drives home the point that Carrie leaves behind a legacy. She's not forgotten when she is passed away. So that's definitely different. And it's important to take into account the time periods in which these books were written. Maltese Falcon was written in the 30s. A Streetcar Named Desire was written in the 40s, and Carrie was written in the 70s. So the Maltese Falcon and A Streetcar Named Desire are kind of World War I, World War II era, whereas Carrie, when it was published, the women's liberation movement was really big at the time. And so this quote is really important to my understanding of how influential Carrie, the novel, is. And so, yeah, it's taken, well, Stephen King wrote it in his Danse Macabre, but then it's quoted in this Sci-Fi Wire article. And I think that King really does a great job of showing that uneasy masculine shrinking from a future of female equality in the book. Yeah, so the important thing is that Carrie is different, and not just in, the small ways about economic, moral, and sexual independence or dependence, but also in the fact that she marks a shift in the transgressing woman archetype. Instead of disappearing from her own narrative, she goes down in history. And so, yeah, this is kind of the culmination of all of my thoughts, that Carrie marks a definitive shift in women's perceived power in society through its unique portrayal of the transgressing woman, Carrie White. So that is it. If you have any questions, you can email me. That's my email. Or please join me for the Q&A on April 14th. I would be thrilled to answer any questions, or even if you just have comments, I would love to hear them. And yeah, thanks again for watching my presentation. And that's my selected bibliography. So.